मसाले तो बहुत हैं, पर प्रकृति की गोद से खास चुने मसाले जिनकी ताजगी, खुशबू और स्वाद रहे बरकरार, ऐसे उम्दा मसाले बनाते हैं सिर्फ कैच। कैच का कोई मैच नहीं, 100%।
In the upcoming session, we have author, columnist, and talk show host Veer Sanghvi in conversation with Srijana Mitra Das, editor at Times Evoke and ET Evoke. In his latest book titled A Rude Life, the memoir, Mr. Sanghvi shares an intimate account of his life, stories about his childhood, and also provides glimpses from the political interactions he's had in the past. Keep watching and enjoy.
Welcome everyone to the Times Literature Festival. I'm Srijana Mitra Das of the Times of India, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you, and in particular to welcome our author of the session, Mr. Veer Sanghvi, celebrated journalist, famous connoisseur, and writer of this absolutely dazzling book, A Rude Life, which, to my mind, is possibly one of the best written books I have read in many years. The panoply of characters that it presents, the stories of all these different people. Meanwhile, Mr. Sanghvi's own life story, all interwoven with absolute skill and ease with the story of India. Through 4 or 5 different decades, done with dazzling ease. The only comparable book I could find to this, Mr. Sanghvi, was Tina Brown's Vanity Fair Diaries. But in my opinion, A Rude Life puts Tina Brown's book in the shade completely. It's a tale of great complexity, which you tell with utmost simplicity. How difficult was it to write this book, to do the time travel in your mind that it required? Was it challenging? How long did it take you? Give us a bit of backdrop into how you began writing this book and how you took the project further.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra Das. And so that I don't have to keep calling you Dr. Mitra Das throughout, please call me Veer for the rest of the session, and I'll call you Srijana.
Sure.
Thank you for the many, many kind things which are wholly undeserved, which you say about the book. But in answer to your question, it happened purely because of circumstances. I've been asked, I've been commissioned, and I've accepted the commission to write memoirs before. And I've always refused because, I mean, we're journalists. Nobody's really interested in our lives, right? They're interested in what we write about. So who would care was always my attitude. And then the lockdown happened, the first lockdown. So I was stuck at home. There wasn't much Zoom around in those days. You couldn't meet anyone. So it was just annoying and irritating. So I thought I'd write, but what do you write about, given that there's nothing but gloom outside? So I chose the sort of obvious subject, which is myself. So when I sat down to write it, I wasn't sure I would remember enough. But the thing that happens as you grow older, and I'm very ancient now, is that while your short-term memory is affected, your long-term memory actually comes back. So when I sat down to write it, I was astonished by how it just flowed and how all these events came together again in my mind, and I could piece them together. It was not the kind of book that I had wanted to write or thought to write. I just sat down and wrote. The formula was do 1 chapter a day, and a chapter, these are short chapters of about 2,000 words, cover one thing in your life, and then go on. There was no structure plan. There was no thought behind it. I just sat down and wrote every day. So in answer to your other question, which is how long it took, well, there were 61 chapters, so 61 days. But given that I didn't write every day, a little under 3 months.
Oh, wow. Quite a feat, I have to say. It really does read also as if it was written in a concentrated space of time. It reads with that kind of pace and energy. I wanted to ask you, Veer, I wanted to ask you about, you've written with utmost candor about your parents, and you've written with great depth about the loss of your father. which is not something that you've been known to discuss in the public sphere before. It must have come as a revelation. It did come as a revelation to me and to obviously to many other readers as well. Was it difficult to write about the fact that your formative experience of life was such a painful one, losing your father and with him the kind of world and the future that he had mapped out for you? Was it hard to open up to strangers who you knew would be reading you and to talk about this?
Yeah, I think it was probably the toughest chapter, right? And it came early. Also, if you actually look at it, I looked at it the other day, that bit is about 2 pages in the book. Yet people respond to it, like, as you said, I've written about it in depth, etc., which I haven't really, but obviously there was a certain intensity of feeling when I wrote it, which makes it seem like it was much longer. Yeah, it was actually the most painful thing to write. I didn't realize it was going to be painful. When you begin the book, it's about my mother running away with my father, with them eloping. And so, haha, jolly, jolly. And then it suddenly takes this dark turn. And I hadn't planned to write it that way. It came out. And it's actually one of the 2 chapters that really got me because I cried after I wrote it.
Yes, I can imagine you must have. I cried after I read it. It is that well written and that emotional. You then talk about Mumbai in the 1970s, sort of, and you're between studying at Oxford and working in Mumbai. There's this canvas of characters who come into your life, people from politics, of course, and also people from the arts, from cinema, from writing. There are drunken poets and there are, affable right-wing leaders. There are industrialists. You described meeting a young and dynamic Mr. Dhirubhai Ambani, who is, clearly running rings around the competition already. There are these dazzling people, each one of whom has a very strong personality of their own, and their personalities come together to make Mumbai this amazing megapolis that it was becoming. What do you think explained this sort of insouciant joie de vivre of all these people connected together in one city at that one time?
It's very hard to explain, because it was a very different India then. It was a pre-liberalization India. There wasn't that sense that came after 1991 that anybody can make it in India, that there's a much greater equality of opportunity. And yet, despite that, as you say, most of the people I ran into in Mumbai had come out of nowhere and had done something quite spectacular. Amitabh Bachchan, who features in that section, was a business executive in Calcutta who worked for a company called Bird and Company, who gave it all up, came to Bombay to become an actor, had tough times. One night he slept on a pavement in Marine Drive. He slept on a bench, to be fair, on Marine Drive because he didn't have a place to spend the night. But he made it. Haji Mastan, who also features in the book, was a coolie, was a loader at the docks. He made it in a very crooked sort of way, but he made it. Dhirubhai Ambani used to be a petrol pump attendant in Aden. He came to Mumbai and he made it. I didn't know then that he would make it as big as he was going to do later. But there was that sense about Bombay, which I think the rest of India perhaps is caught up with. It was very much the city of dreams. There was that sense that anything can happen.
It's very, very fascinating. There were also darker clouds on the horizon. Sanjay Gandhi comes across in your book as this strange and peculiar sort of personality, almost malevolent at times. Tell us a little bit about Sanjay Gandhi. And, we still haven't, certainly readers of my generation haven't seen a single person with that kind of power, who hasn't really been elected to power, but still wields that kind of enormous power. Tell us what it was like to live in a time when someone like that really wielded, such power over India.
Mrs. Gandhi was revered all over India. She'd won these big mandates. She'd broken up Pakistan. When she ran into trouble and when she declared the emergency, there was always that sneaking suspicion that she'd, been driven to it. There was a threat of civil unrest, that she was doing this temporarily. She didn't like it. All that hope died in 1976, about 6 months after the emergency had been declared, when Sanjay Gandhi appeared out of nowhere. People heard vaguely about Sanjay Gandhi. We knew that Indira Gandhi had two sons. One of them was a quiet pilot at Indian Airlines and didn't want to get involved in politics. The other one we knew was a motor mechanic of some description. And we knew he tried to start a small car project and that had not worked. And he used to hang around with characters who might charitably be called thugs. When this guy suddenly became the chosen successor, she suddenly started promoting him. In those days, there was no television as such, very little television. But if you went in to see a movie, there would be a film division documentary. And that documentary would be youth leader Sanjay Gandhi's visit to Bihar or whatever. And it was almost North Korean, the way in which she was promoting him. People we discovered that we didn't know that then, we discovered later, people who'd been close to her were humiliated by Sanjay Gandhi. Inder Gujral, who was her friend, told me the story of coming back. He was the INB minister, coming to see the prime minister and being stopped by Sanjay, who said, I saw the news yesterday. This was not good enough. You have to say more supportive things about my mother on Doordarshan. Ye sab nahi chalega. And Gujral said, nahi chalega. What is this? So he wandered off. The next day, Mr. Gandhi called him and sacked him.
Wow.
There was that sense that everything had changed. P.N. Haksar, more than anybody else, created the legend of Indira Gandhi. Not only was he ousted, his family used to have a shop in Connaught Place. They were raided. The owner was paraded around the streets. Every humiliation possible was heaped on people who'd once been close to Mrs. Gandhi. So what you then had was a leader who'd once been revered, promoting her son. And the son, who had the reputation of being a thug, did nothing to change that reputation or change that image of being a thug. So for many of us, that was like the final disillusionment with Indira Gandhi. This was not about democracy or about preserving India any longer. And we don't realize it then. But though Mrs. Gandhi was Nehru's daughter, he'd never made her prime minister. He was dead by the time it happened. This was the first time dynasty became an important part of Indian politics. If there had been no Sanjay Gandhi, there would have been no Rajiv Gandhi to replace him when he died or whatever. It's what made dynasty respectable in Indian politics and has led eventually to the situation today where the choice is between one kind of communal politics and dynasty, and democracy doesn't get a look in.
We'll come back to dynasty in a short while. I want to now go on to, the fact that you wrote about what was happening in Punjab already by the mid-80s and the sort of completely botched up military operation at the Golden Temple, the resentments, the hatreds that, ensued, and then the Sikh massacres. Now, what I found very interesting in your book was the role that you say was played by Narasimha Rao, who was then the Home Minister. And would you tell us a little bit about why Narasimha Rao is such a central figure in the way the Sikh massacres happened and were allowed to go on? And are you saying, to put it metaphorically, of course, basically the butler did it? Are you absolving the Prime Minister of the time of all blame for how the Sikh massacres unfolded?
No, absolutely not. I would never absolve Rajiv Gandhi of any blame for this. He was the Prime Minister. It happened on his watch. The responsibility must be his. Equally, there were stories that the mobs were led by Congress leaders. And some of those stories you can say are exaggerated. There's some dispute about whether Jagdish Tytler was involved, etc. But there are enough stories about enough leaders to make it clear that they were politically inspired. So no, you can't absolve the Congress party of responsibility at all. But there is, as you say, the butler in the story, which is that the Delhi police who vanished and allowed Sikhs to be massacred were under the Home Minister, who in those days was Narasimha Rao. Narasimha Rao either slept through the whole thing, as he did later during the Babri Masjid demolition, or decided he wasn't going to get involved. Now, you can't take the line that the Home Minister of India, who is in charge of the police, bears no responsibility. He does bear some responsibility. And in the book, there's an anecdote I tell about Chandrasekhar, who later became Prime Minister, whose son had a friend who was a Sikh, who kept calling him very panic-stricken and saying, there's an area where they're burning Sikhs' homes, they're killing us, I need to get away. And Chandrasekhar's son said, I'm going to go and get my friend. And Chandrasekhar said, no, let's do it properly. I'll call the Home Minister and maybe we can get you a police escort. And Narasimha Rao, his Home Minister, said, no, it's very dangerous to go there. Tell your son not to go over there. Effectively, leave these Sikhs to their own fate. I mean, Chandrasekhar is a decent man, so they did go, they did rescue that family, and they brought it to Chandrasekhar's house. But that was Narasimha Rao's attitude. So it is not my case that he was responsible for the massacres, but it is my case that he cannot escape all blame.
Right. It's very interesting also that you then describe Rajiv Gandhi takes over, of course, as Prime Minister, and you then describe the tension between him and the then President Gyani Zail Singh. It's actually fascinating to read your descriptions of the Gyani in the presidential house. I just wondered when I read that, the kind of tension that ensued between Rajiv Gandhi and Gyani Zail Singh seemed to almost have an echo in the tension we now see between Rahul Gandhi and the G23. Has the Congress had this long history of older men who were once extremely close to a prior center of power, kind of whittling away at the next guy who comes along and undermining him?
Yeah, I never thought about it that way, and it is a bit far-fetched, but yes, I can see the parallels. But there is, certainly there's truth in that there was a transition from Indira Gandhi to Rajiv Gandhi. In the time that Rajiv Gandhi was alive, and Indira Gandhi was both alive, contrary to what people say, Rajiv was not a number two. Mrs. Gandhi had many advisors. The man who made the decisions was R.K. Dhawan, who was her private secretary. She depended on Pranab Mukherjee. She depended on Zail Singh, who was the Home Minister. And Rajiv, Arun Nehru, Arun Singh was a rival crowd, which also gave opinions. And often she overruled those opinions. So these guys grew up in politics, hating Zail Singh, Dhawan, Pranab Mukherjee. And when Rajiv became Prime Minister, they went out of the way to get him. Pranab Mukherjee was humiliated, was sent off to West Bengal as some kind of local leader. They did badly in municipal elections. Arun Nehru called him, shouted at him and told him to resign on the spot. Dhawan was framed shamefully for Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. A so-called court of inquiry said he was involved in the murder, and he was in disgrace. In the case of Zail Singh, this was more difficult to do because Zail Singh was president of India. But it didn't stop them from having complete contempt for Zail Singh. And Zail Singh, to be fair to the other side, was not the kind of guy you admired or respected instantly. This is the man who, when he was appointed president of India, he was appointed candidate, told the press that as far as he was concerned, it was just another job. My leaders asked me to do it. If she had asked me to pick up a jhadu and sweep the floor, I would have swept the floor. So these are not exactly high-minded presidential statements. So you were dealing with one crowd of people who had scores to settle, and one guy who'd got far on chamchagiri and sucking up to Mrs. Gandhi, who now felt bereft. So that contributed, I think, to the tension.
Very interesting. At this point, you were moving to Calcutta and settling down there with Sunday. What made you fall in love with the city whose language even you were unfamiliar with? What really excited you about Calcutta?
It's very hard to say. Because there's two ways of looking at it. One is the way I look at it, which is that Calcutta has a soul, that people are very warm, people are very genuine, and you respond to that and you react to that. It takes a little bit of time because you don't understand the language. They're not necessarily very welcoming. But once they do get to know you, you form very firm friendships. And there's a lot of emotion in most things Bengalis do, even if it's pouring themselves a cup of coffee. So you begin to respond to that emotion. That's my view. There's a cynical view, which is that you've read The Continent of Circe by Niraj Chaudhary.
Yes, of course, yes.
Which says that there is this continent where everybody just lies around and does nothing. And no matter whether it's Muslims, the British, any invader who comes to India just gets seduced by all of this and becomes as lazy as the other. So when I read it originally, I thought it was rubbish. But having gone to Calcutta, I realized that this is not so much a book. Sorry, having gone to Calcutta, I realized that this is not so much a book about India as it is a book about Bengal. So that's certainly true about Bengal. And so I wonder sometimes, was I just seduced in the continent of Circe? Did I relax in the lazy energy of Calcutta? Is that what got me? I don't know.
Do you find Calcutta today as exciting?
It's a very different city. I go there and I don't necessarily recognize it. The road from the airport into Calcutta, it's a completely different city. It's much richer than it used to be in my time. There's much more money. It's even more bustling. There's things like electronic city. So it's a difficult city to relate to.
Right. At this point, you were also, of course, constantly hiring, building up a newsroom for Sunday, all of that. At this point, you recount an interesting conversation you had with the proprietor. And he tells you, when there's a conflict of choice between two different candidates, that you should hire the Brahmin one. Yeah. This is interesting because it also highlights how newsrooms were. They were full of basically rather privileged men. And it seems like, they were really a kind of a space that was carved out for upper caste, generally upper class men primarily. I wondered if that in any way shaped the news itself. Did that shape worldviews? Did that shape front pages? Did that shape editorial pages, features?
It's an interesting perspective. In the case of Sunday, that wasn't true because when we did hire and we started hiring me, all three of the candidates we hired were women. But in the case of the Bengali papers, it may well have been true. I didn't speak Bengali. I didn't read the Bengali papers. I didn't know exactly what was going on. But yeah, there were a fair number of upper caste men who were running the show.
And was it true in the case of non-Bengali papers, as in more sort of national media?
I don't think so. I think about the only thing that always struck me as odd was, we're now talking about the 80s and the 90s. I don't think till then there'd been a single Muslim who'd edited a national newspaper, with the exception of MJ Akbar, and he started his own paper. It's not that anybody appointed him. So I think that struck me as being pretty damning for the Indian media.
That's interesting. At this point, Kashmir, of course, explodes with violence. Now, you write, this is very interesting. I wrote it down and I'm quoting you. You said, the media downplayed the separatist strand that had been a part of Kashmir politics from 1947 onwards. I want to ask you, why did the media do that?
I think we've always kidded ourselves in India and said that every Kashmiri is at heart an Indian. When the Sikh problem broke out, I always thought that we were okay because every Sikh, the vast majority at any rate, in his heart was an Indian. I think Kashmiris were conflicted because of the pressure from Pakistan, because of the strong separatist strand in their politics. And I always thought Kashmir therefore needed to be handled differently. For some reason in the media, we never played this up. And I'm saying Kashmir, but it wasn't so unusual. If you spoke to the Mizos and the Nagas during that period, they were also not 100% certain that they were fully paid up members of the Indian Union. There was a separatist strand as well. And as we know, till the 60s, the policy of the DMK was secession. They wanted to secede from India. So it's possible to make too much of the separatist strand in Kashmir politics. It happened in many parts of India, but 100% it was there. And it was foolish to deny it, and yet we did deny it. In the media, we kept saying that things were fine. Elections were rigged. We would never even cover the fact that elections were rigged, never mention it. And sometimes people saw it the other way. For instance, Pakistan in 1965, before the full army attack, sent in infiltrators and believed that these infiltrators would caused the people of Kashmir to rise up against the Indian yoke. In fact, the people of Kashmir picked them up and took them to the nearest police stations, and that uprising, alleged uprising or attempted uprising, failed. So yes, To say that every Kashmiri was a separatist or whatever was wrong, but equally to say that there was no separatist strand was wrong. And so therefore, when things went out of control in 1989, and my view for why they went out of control is different from other people. 1989 is when the Afghan conflict ends. So the ISI and the Pakistanis are left with fighters with nowhere to send them. They send them to Kashmir and they create as much trouble as they can in Kashmir. But if you were prime minister during that period and you saw that this was happening and you realized that there was already a separatist strand, what you should have done, surely for any sensible person, was put a lid on it, done something to understand how bad things were. VP Singh really couldn't care less. He just mucked it up, which is one reason we're in this mess today.
Yeah, yeah. We do talk about VP Singh's very doubtful legacy. But interestingly, VP Singh's legacy was also one in terms of Mandal, which no other political leader who has since followed had the nerve to change. Why do you think that is?
Well, Mandal was always there. There was always this recognition within Indian politics, particularly cowbelt politics, that if you made those kind of appeals to backward castes, you promised them various things, there was room to grow. This was not really a breathtaking discovery or a shattering discovery. Most politicians just took the line that India was moving away from caste. We forget that the 1984 victory, which is the Rajiv Gandhi victory, which preceded VP Singh's, was casteless. Everybody voted one way, regardless of caste. Mrs. Gandhi's victories have been casteless. The 77 Janta victory was not based on caste. So there was a growing acknowledgement that India, or at least political India, was moving away from caste. People were voting for other factors, including the issues. And that if you went back to caste, yes, you might do okay, but you would create terrible schisms within Indian society. I went talking to Chandrasekhar about this before it happened, and he said Chandrasekhar was a good sort of rustic accent. He said, "Ye to social welfare hoga." So they knew that there was social warfare, and they didn't want to do it. VP Singh broke that rule cynically because he wanted to win.
But nobody's had the nerve since to go back to a non-social welfare state, as it were.
No, I think that's one of those things that once you start doing something, like Mr. Modi, I remember in the BJP, criticized the social welfare schemes that the UPA had introduced. Other than putting his own name on them, I can't think of any changes he's made.
Right. I thought it was very interesting that you just brought up the end of the first Afghan jihad, which is what you write about as well at this time. And the fact that Pakistan, once the Soviets had left Afghanistan, had nowhere else to send its militant fighters, let's put it that way, but Kashmir. In an odd sort of combination of circumstances, we find ourselves now, exactly a week after the end of the second Afghan jihad, as it were, and in place of the Soviets, the Americans have now been routed. Pakistan is certainly triumphant with regard to all its machinations and all its plotting and planning in Afghanistan. What are the implications, according to you, of what they're going to try in Kashmir now?
I'm not an expert in Kashmir, but it seems to me from my perspective that they will repeat what they did in 1989. They will start all this jihad stuff again. They will send fighters in. The Taliban are already talking about the situation in Kashmir. They will try and internationalize Kashmir, if not internationalize it, at least make it a big issue within the Muslim world. And I think we're in for a lot of trouble.
It's very interesting that you recount Benazir Bhutto told you that the ISI had actually persuaded Osama bin Laden to stick around in South Asia, even after the end of the first Afghan war. Do you think, by sort of logical reasoning then, that the ISI might well have been aware of the Osama bin Laden plot that became 9/11, perhaps even supportive of it?
There isn't enough evidence to say they were supportive of it, but it would certainly be very odd if nobody in the ISI had any idea. The ISI had very close links with the Taliban. Osama was being sheltered by the Taliban. The plot was hatched in Kandahar and parts of Afghanistan, which were controlled by the Taliban with the assistance of the ISI. It's hard to believe that an international huge plot of this magnitude could happen without some ISI guys being involved.
Which is very interesting given how close the Americans, well, certainly how dependent the Americans now are on the ISI. I wanted to now bring you into the 2000s. And you, of course, describe, well, UPA 1, UPA 2, sort of intricate detail. The one person who comes out in a less than favorable light in your assessment at this time, very surprisingly, is Manmohan Singh, hero of the middle classes, the so-called father of Indian reforms, um, absolutely incorruptible. And yet, you present a less than favorable assessment of him. You even say he could have been one of the biggest reasons for the downfall of the Congress in 2014. Why do you say so?
Okay, I think I've known Manmohan Singh for a while. I really like him. He has many, many admirable qualities. He's a gentle person. He's a kind person. He can be patient. He's sometimes without ego. He can talk equally to various people. There's stories in the book of how I went in and asked him what the subprime crisis was in the US, and he sat down and he explained it to me, reverting to the history, the economics professor he once was. He's a man of great integrity. He's also a brilliant economist. I think all of this we must recognize and give him credit for. What I disagree with is this view of Manmohan Singh as a chap who was put up as a puppet prime minister. I don't think he was. I think he always wanted to be prime minister. He said that to me in interviews on record. I think he knew that Indira Gandhi was, what was wrong with me? He knew that Sonia Gandhi was going to make prime minister. He was expecting it. He wasn't surprised when it happened. I think it worked well during the first term because there was a balance between the way in which he ran the government and the way in which Mrs. Gandhi ran the party. It collapsed in the second term for a variety of reasons, one of which was the nuclear deal. I don't know if you remember this, but the nuclear deal, which everybody supported, began to look dubious because the left said it would bring the government down. So Manmohan Singh waited till towards the end of the UPA's term and then said that if you don't do the nuclear deal now, I will resign. So they said to him that, yes, if you do that, the government will fall. And he said, no, it's your job to make sure the government doesn't fall, but this is my moral position. Now, your job to make sure the government mustn't fall means go out and buy enough MPs to win the vote. So you had a strange paradox that to keep his high moral position intact, they had to do the most immoral things, which they did. And they managed to win that vote, and they went on to win the election. They won the election much better than that, with a much bigger majority than they had UPA won. I suspect, and this is my view, that Manmohan Singh began to believe all this Singh is king nonsense and began to believe that he had won the election single-handed. As this happened, and there were people around him who encouraged this view, as this happened, Sonia Gandhi fell ill, was away for long periods of time. I don't think Manmohan Singh had any rapport with Ahmed Patel or with Rahul Gandhi or with anybody else who was left. So the balance that had kept the UPA afloat collapsed. Even this would have been all right if you hadn't had the Anna Hazare movement, you hadn't had the global economy going to the toilet. And as the problems mounted, and as the media found scam after scam, Manmohan Singh, the obvious option was to emerge as a leader to take it on head on. But he didn't do that. He went into hiding. He never spoke to anyone. There were jokes about how quiet he was, stuff like, what did the dentist say to Manmohan Singh? This time you'll have to open your mouth, for instance. That was a very popular joke at the time. And while he sort of hid himself away and people wondered what was happening, he was content to portray himself as a victim of the Gandhis, the whole sort of accidental prime minister thesis, which became the basis of the movie. So you had a situation where the people of India believed that the government was being run by scamsters, that these scamsters were probably sponsored by 10 Janpath, and this Manmohan Singh was too weak because he was under the boots of the evil Sonia Gandhi and therefore could do nothing. So played along with that whole victim idea, but he also created a leadership vacuum. By the time people were through looking for the prime minister while Manmohan Singh is hiding under his desk, they were ready for a real leader. And that vacuum is what led to Mr. Narendra Modi's popularity.
That's absolutely fascinating. It's not a thesis that you hear very often, but it is certainly plausible.
Because what we have generally now, among liberals particularly, is nice Manmohan, evil Narendra Modi. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Nobody is all good or all bad.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that really, the way you capture, for instance, the affable personality of Bal Thackeray and the rather unpleasant shades to Dom Moraes. It shows you that it's your book really brings to light how you cannot judge a book by its cover.
Well said.
I wanted to also ask you now, there's a very significant absence in your book towards the end of it. The one person who you don't mention and you don't draw one of your famous pen portraits of is Priyanka Gandhi. She remains an enigma wrapped in a mystery, as it were. You talk about, of course, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, you talk about Rahul Gandhi, you admire Rahul Gandhi's positive qualities. You don't mention Priyanka Gandhi at all. Is this deliberate?
No, this is an autobiography, not a history book. So I've written about people I've met. I've met Priyanka Gandhi once for half an hour with other people present. I've never met her one-on-one. I don't know enough about her to write about her.
And you haven't formed any ideas about her either, presumably then?
No, I can form ideas about her from reading the newspapers. But the point of this book is that it gives you a bit more than you read in the newspapers. And here I have no insights.
Right. Okay, I wanted to now, ask you about social media. You're quite bitter about Twitter, as it were. You talk about the troll armies and the bots and the maligning that happens in social media, both Twitter and Facebook. So it's not just one platform; it's all of them. The kind of misinformation.
WhatsApp is the worst in many ways.
It's the worst. You talk about this. These are now facts which a large number of people do know. We all know about the damage that social media is doing to our social lives and to our democracy. Yet we're on it all the time. We're constantly online. We're hooked to these platforms. We want to be seen on them. Many people I know spend their entire day, and these are employed professionals performing for Twitter or performing for whichever social media they're on. Why is that? When we know what these platforms are doing to us, why are we still on them 24 hours?
Well, there's a lot of work being done on this, suggesting that there's a phenomenon called social media addiction, and that the social media companies have promoted this addiction. But leaving aside that kind of stuff, I'm not on Facebook, for instance. I'm not on any medium that requires me to provide personal information about myself or what I've done. I'm on Twitter. And my contributions to it tend to be political. They tend to be part of the debate. I am very conscious that when I am on Twitter, I'm likely to be combating an army of trolls or bots or glove puppets. But whereas earlier, say 10, 11 years ago, I thought they were all real people and took it to heart. Now I know what it is. I mean, the 2 rupee wallahs will say what they have to say, and you say what you have to say.
Right. Okay. I do want to also ask you, you're quite worried about the effect of social media on the news. That comes out in your book. Tell us a little bit about why you're concerned.
Well, I was concerned initially because I don't know if you remember this, but in the old days when people hadn't realized quite how corrupted Twitter had been, they used to carry tweets at the bottom of the screen. Some people do, as though those tweets reflected the views of their readers. They used to conduct Twitter polls. And of course, these polls were always rigged by somebody, the other's IT cell, but they used to take them very seriously. But what Twitter has done, I think more than any other social medium, is create a culture in which people are rude to each other, people are offensive to each other. And they can do this because they have the advantage of distance. Yeah, you don't really see the guy you're writing to or whatever. What's happened now with television, for instance, let's talk about that, is that people no longer come to studios even before the pandemic and conduct debates. What you have are little windows in which people sitting at home. In the old days, you send OB vans, now it's done on Zoom, say things to each other. And the language that they have adopted is not the language people used to adopt when they had television debates, when they spoke to each other or whatever. It's the language of Twitter. Also, the political spokespeople on these television programs are effectively sort of troll farms with their lips moving. Whenever they sense that a debate is not going their way or whatever, they will break up the debate. They will interrupt. They will start shouting. They won't let anybody else speak. And so, therefore, that whole notion of television being a medium where you could discuss an issue is gone. It's not true in the rest of the world. If you go on to CNN, they will have experts who will come in and give you their opinions. Occasionally, they'll have two people from opposing political parties who will say what they think, and they will disagree, but they will disagree civilly. In India, on the other hand, it's not television, it's the WWF, it's a wrestling match.
A fixed one at that.
Exactly, that which is what WWF is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just take you back for a second to the 1970s, I think, when you took a short sabbatical from journalism and you did your INLATS project on the new information order. I think this is a good time to visit that project again. And why don't you share with us some insights or observations you made in that project, which perhaps have an echo or a resonance with what we're seeing with the information order today?
Okay. I think there were two separate aspects to it. One was what I was interested in. When I was at university in England and when I was growing up in England, there was a general belief among Indians who lived there and in America that the media were out to get us, that whatever the press said about us was negative because they couldn't bear the idea of an India that had managed to survive without colonial interference. I thought it was an idea worth examining, so I traveled. I couldn't do the whole world, but I did England and America. I went to newsrooms, I spoke to editors, I looked at how India had been covered. And my conclusion then was that by and large, India didn't matter. At least in America, it didn't matter at all. It mattered in England, but it mattered as a source of color stories rather than a source of serious political analysis. And the one time India was guaranteed to get into the papers was when there was an earthquake or there was a flood or there was a famine. So to that extent, yes, we were right in saying that they weren't really concerned about us and they had a vaguely negative view of us. But we were wrong to believe, I thought, that there was a conspiracy to say that how can these brown chaps survive without us white people running them. They didn't resent our success because frankly, during that period, there wasn't that much success. At the same time, UNESCO was running something called the New International Information Order. And the argument there was because news was dominated by the West, we should have third world organizations like third world news agencies that gave out our point of view. The problem was that all of these were going to be run by tin pot democracies or tin pot dictatorships more than democracies, though they were officially called democracies, that really had no interest in free press within their own countries. So how were you going to expect them to take forward free ideas outside? There is an echo now because India is getting a really bad press globally. And many people, mostly people sympathetic to this government, are saying it's because the New York Times can't bear to see India do so well, or the Washington Post resents what we are doing. I mean, everybody's entitled to their views, but these same people didn't resent how well we were doing 6 years ago, 7 years ago. The coverage of India was largely positive in the Western press in those days. The fact that it's changed can't just be explained by racism or a hatred of our success. There have to be other explanations.
That's interesting. My last question to you actually goes back to 6 or 7 years ago, when the Congress was still in power and Mr. Modi was still the challenger on the horizon. Your book very meticulously, very intricately, and with great irony at times, puts out this amazing portrait of the old boy network, this sort of, tremendous world of contacts and influence and, acquaintances working across India in different fields. But with great irony, you sketch that entire, the sort of mega network network that was happening across the country. How is it that by 2014, the Congress, which had reasonably intelligent people as its members, didn't realize the extent to which India was now fed up of this enormous canvas of networks and contacts and famous last names and privileged access? How did the Congress not understand how deeply the rest of India resented it and was so frustrated with this way of politicking and living that it would seek an alternative and a powerful one at that?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is that post 1991, because of the reforms, we had the creation of a new middle class. These were people who hadn't earlier been part of the middle class, whose parents were not English speakers, who themselves were not great English speakers, who'd never read newspapers at home, who now, when they came into influence, relied on WhatsApp because they had no newspaper reading tradition, had no sense of what television was supposed to be like, and were happy to see television turned into a wrestling match, and that these people resented the old networks and the old elite. I think that would be the Congress's view. The Congress also took the line that while this was a very noisy class, it was not necessarily representative of India as a whole. And that dynasty, yes, okay, fair enough. People were fed up of dynasty, but how has Jagan been elected defending the Congress? Why is Akhilesh, a big time leader, still in UP? That if you look at state political parties, dynasty continues to be perfectly acceptable. And that dynasty now is used only as a stick to beat the Congress with. So the Congress will argue that yes, there is a new middle class which owes allegiance to Mr. Modi because it sees Mr. Modi as representing its interests. This is the middle class you hear on WhatsApp or see on Twitter and sometimes see on television, but this is not India. No, I don't agree. I think this is India. I think India has changed. But what the Congress is saying is a valid view.
That's very interesting. I know I said last question, but I have to ask you this.
Yeah.
What's up with the word rude? Your life has been anything but rude.
Yeah.
It's one of the most polished lives I have heard of until now, and many, many more such events and episodes to come, I'm sure, in your life. It's not a rude life. It's a remarkably sophisticated life. Why do you call it a rude life? Why do you call
Okay,
it rude?
the title was not mine. I wasn't even pleased about it. The title was Penguins. And it's a reflection, I think they said, not of my life, but of the tone of the book, which they said was much more irreverent compared to other memoirs and occasionally rude. But yes, I keep getting asked why it is called a rude life, and I keep inventing new answers every time. Well, actually, I don't know.
Well, I just want to conclude, Mr. Sanghvi, by reading to you something that reminded me entirely of your book, Harold Pinter's Note on Shakespeare, where he writes, and I quote, "Shakespeare writes of the open wound, and through him, we know it open and know it closed." And then, of course, he goes on Shakespeare's trials and tribulations and atmospherics and the personalities he meets and so on. And then he says, "The fabric never breaks. The wound is open. The wound is peopled. Your book starts with a wound, which you then brilliantly people." I think it's an absolutely remarkable volume. It is rude at times, but delightfully so. Mr. Sanghvi, thank you so much for writing this fantastic book.
Thank you, Dr. Mithridas. It was really enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching today's sessions. Please join us tomorrow between 5 to 7 p.m. to watch our upcoming 3 sessions. We will start a session with none other than actress Priyanka Chopra Jonas talking about her book Unfinished to festival director Vinita Daura Nangia. The next session will be on untold stories of royalties from India and beyond. And finally, the last session will be on bone-chilling horror stories and the fascination for them.